Hello, I hope you're doing well today. It is now March, which means summer is over in Australia. I'm someone who kind of likes summer in that I hate being cold, so I prefer it when it is warm outside, but I never do anything summery, like I never go to the beach or really leave my house because it's too hot. So I'm very much looking forward to autumn, where the weather cools down at night and doesn't get quite as hot in the day. March also means that it is time for me to do my February reading wrap-up. So the first book I read in February was The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This is about 16-year-old Star. She lives between two different worlds, the poor neighborhood that she lives in and has grown up in, and the posh high school in the suburbs that she goes to. The story starts with Star at a party in her neighborhood. At the party she sees one of her oldest friends, Khalil, and as they're talking they hear gunshots coming from somewhere in the party. So they get out of there as fast as they can and Khalil drives them off in his car. While they're driving away, a policeman stops them and starts harassing Khalil to the point where the policeman pulls out his gun and fatally shoots Khalil. The book then follows on from the aftermath of this incident and talks about issues regarding police brutality against black people in America and gang violence as well. Young adult books that talk about important issues like this are so important, I think, for teenagers because they make these issues really accessible to young people, whether that be a teenager who doesn't know anything about the issue or whether it be a teenager who is or could be affected by this and so provides some representation for them. I think this book really cleverly mixes the sort of traditional young adult tropes of dealing with high school and friends and boyfriends and parents with the really serious issues of the gun violence and Black Lives Matter. I think Star is the perfect protagonist to follow along. She is completely just an ordinary teenager while also being an extraordinary teenager in that she is put in a position that no 16-year-old should ever have to go through. I definitely recommend it. For me, I felt like it was a really amazing way to get a more personal account of these kinds of issues, which before I've only really been able to read about in the news, which is such an impersonal way of learning about it. The next book I read was The Ladies of Missolonghi by Colleen McCulloch. This is about a woman called Missy. She is a 30-something old maid and she lives with her elderly mum and aunt in a fictional town in the Blue Mountains called Byron at the beginning of the 1900s. Missy's life is dull and full of everyday chores and she has no marriage prospects until a mysterious stranger comes into the town and disrupts the lives of the one extended family that seems to be the only inhabitants of the town. Colleen McCulloch is quite a famous Australian author. This is my mum's book and I picked it up because the idea of a story set in the Blue Mountains in the Edwardian era really appealed to me. At the beginning it starts off fairly conventionally in the way you'd expect a story about spinsters in the Edwardian era to go. The writing felt very forced in that it was trying to emulate the language of the early 1900s and kind of failing at it. It read a little bit like some of the stories I used to write when I was about 15 because I was obsessed with Victorian and Edwardian literature and wanted to try and write like that myself. But then the book takes some really weird turns. Missy decides that she's going to marry the stranger that's come into town and she persuades him to marry her by pretending that she has a heart condition and that she's going to die in a year. And then it turns out she's really good at sex, so he agrees to marry her. There's lots of really disturbing things the characters say, but one in particular was after he's married Missy, the guy's like, "I'm growing more reconciled to marrying you every time you open your mouth, not to mention your legs." I mean, it was so cringy and gross and it kind of felt like I was reading the author's kind of weird erotic fantasy and that it had been accidentally published instead of the real story. Also, in the very last pages of the novel, it introduces a ghost supernatural element and that just made me laugh basically. It was so absurd. So yeah, would not recommend this. I pretty much only finished it because it was so short and I was almost finished anyway, and the descriptions of the Blue Mountains are really nice. Next I read Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This very heavy book follows the lives of Efemelu and Obins, though mainly it's from Efemelu's point of view. They grow up in Lagos in Nigeria, they meet in high school and start dating and continue to date each other all the way through university until Efemelu moves to America to study and something happens in America that leads them to become estranged from each other. The book starts off with a chapter from Efemelu, who is planning to return to Lagos after 15 years of living in America. This is not a plot heavy book, it is mainly a lot of observations about America, and she has a really interesting perspective on race in America due to having that outside perspective. I really liked the writing. It was really evocative and very detailed. There are multitudes of characters and each one felt completely rounded and real, even if they were only in the story for a few pages. It definitely felt like a lot of the book was first-hand observations from the author herself. It didn't feel like the author was making a judgment on anything. It mainly felt like describing and observing and just noting down experiences and cultural differences. It was really fascinating to see what stood out to Efemelu as being particularly weird. And then it was also really interesting when Efemelu went back to Lagos and her experience of the city after being so long in America. I feel like I learned a lot from this book. I'm definitely curious to read more of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's novels. The last book I read was Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. This is about a high schooler called Simon. He has a pretty ordinary high school life, apart from the fact that nobody knows that he's gay. The only person who does know is someone he's been emailing with anonymously, whose pseudonym is Blue. The only thing he knows about Blue is that Blue is also gay and is in the same year as him at high school. I wanted to read this as the film is coming out this year, and I have no idea if I'll get to see it, but in case I do, I want to have read the book first. And I found it a really fun and engaging read. For most of it, it is so light-hearted, but then when it does get serious, it gets you very incredibly emotional, especially obviously the bits where Simon does eventually come out for the first time, and then when he comes out to his family as well. I was reading this book really fast, and in those particular scenes, it suddenly felt like everything slowed down, like the book was forcing me to read those bits a lot slower because of the emotion in them and because of the importance. I definitely felt the characters in this were a lot less stereotypical than your average American YA, and I really genuinely cared about what happened to them. The bit that annoyed me the most about this book was his parents. I found them so incredibly annoying. They were so nosy and obnoxious about knowing everything about Simon's life, and their whole excuse was like, oh, it's hard to see our children grow up and not need us to look after them anymore. It's like, that's what you should expect when becoming a parent, because inevitably that's going to happen. I'm definitely more curious about seeing the film now after reading it, because it is first person from Simon's perspective and so very much in his head that it would be very interesting to see how they adapt that to a visual medium. As always, please let me know if you've read any of those books in the comments and your thoughts on them. This month, the shortlist for the Stella Prize gets announced. The Stella Prize is a book prize for both fiction and non-fiction books that were written by Australian women. I think I mentioned it before on this channel, but it was created in response to the Miles Franklin, which is Australia's major book prize, and with the Miles Franklin, a lot of male authors are winning, so the Stella Prize was created to counteract that. So this month, I am planning on reading a bunch of books that either won or were nominated for the Stella Prize in the last few years that it's been running. So my next reading wrap-up will be a Stella Prize special. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I will see you soon. Bye!